Hey everyone, welcome to Software Sales Simplified, Move to Success, a podcast for software sales professionals who want to sell better. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting out, make Software Sales Simplified your go-to resource for actionable insights and real-world strategies. Join us right here where you get your favorite podcasts, and we'll move to success together. I'm your host, Matt Long, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Kevin Donville. Say hi, Kevin.
Hi, Kevin. Good to see you.
Thank you, sir. Together, we have over 50 years of enterprise software selling experience, and we just wrote a book about it. So if you want to hear about our approach to sales, the book is called Winning Faster, the MOVE Framework for Enterprise Sales Success, and you can find a link to it in our description. So today, we're joined by an old friend and colleague of mine, Ryan Anderson. I met Ryan about 15 years ago when he was at Accenture Interactive, I believe. And he has a big, warm personality and is a very smart guy to boot. So I'm really glad to have you on, Ryan.
Awesome. I will take care of that $20 after the podcast. It's great.
That's good. Amazon card, Starbucks,
right.
Whatever works.
Venmo, yeah. whatever works.
One reason Ryan and I have been in touch over the years, and more recently been talking a lot about value and how he kind of frames value in his engagements and things that he does. And I'll let him talk more about that in a bit. But it's a really nice tie-in because, as you know, the third pillar of our MOVE framework is value, right? So we actually had a podcast a couple of weeks ago where we talked about actually the last part of that engagement where you're proving the value, right? But we haven't really talked about how do you map and identify and articulate that value, right? And so Ryan, I think, has a lot of great experience and stories around that. So with that being said, let me kick it over to you, Ryan, to do a little intro.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt and Kevin. I feel honored to be here and be part of this conversation with you guys. I've really just been impressed with the podcast and what you've been doing. So I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to having this conversation all about value. I'll do a quick kind of background that's, kind of relevant to our topic today. 20 plus years in digital innovation for me, and really the core of my experience sits at the intersection of, I guess, these kind of cross-training areas of digital marketing, enterprise sales, and customer experience. And so, I've had this kind of combination that's sort of, in my view, allowed me to see how buyers move across the customer journey, right? And what that entire scope of interaction looks like with companies. And so I think that has really shaped the kind of roles and initiatives that I've been part of in these companies. I was lucky to spend a little time at Google in their search marketing division. And then, as you mentioned, Matt, at Accenture, when Accenture Song was just interactive in its first year. And so I was part of that management team that grew effectively from zero to $1 billion in revenue in the first few years. And in doing so, launched this, their customer experience practice and what that looked like. And that was part of what we worked on together at that time. And I think sort of that the other part of that was then going to Wipro Digital and being able to take all of the kind of those past experiences and learnings and playbooks and bring that to launching their first global digital transformation practice.
Wow.
It was incredible. So bringing together like these aspects of how does customer experience connect in with employee experience as it relates to the way that customers buy from businesses. And so that really opened my eyes to a broader look at that journey that we're all very familiar with. So I'm now, as you mentioned, I'm starting a company that in the next few weeks, there will be more about that. But really, it's helping revenue teams decode what each buyer in their opportunity list values the most value and aligns the way that they bring their offering. How do these sellers bring their offering to those buyers across the purchase journey? It's not an easy thing to do, as you know, and it's really tough to do it consistently, right? With an automated motion. And so that's kind of the concept that I'm building and working on, and hence why I'm super excited to have this conversation today.
Well, we're really happy to have you here because I think you're going to have a great addition, a lot of great insights about this topic. I just wanted to touch on something really quickly that you mentioned before we get into our value discussion, which was around, learning about the company's employees as you're evaluating a company and product, right? And I think that's one thing that doesn't get stated enough in the sales cycle is that they're evaluating you as a seller and as a team member and how you interact with people, right, as well. And that's something that people really need to realize is that they're thinking about what it's a relationship with this person and this company going to look like, and you are the face of that. So
You're
I
spot
think
on.
yeah, that's a great thing to keep in mind as well. But maybe to kick it off, why don't we just talk about like, well, what does value actually mean? What are we talking about when we say
Yeah.
value? Because we use it a lot, but
Yeah.
how would you describe value?
It's a great question. You might say you hear things like, oh, I got a smoking deal on that, whatever purchase. So I got a lot of value. But I think in this case, when we're talking about, B2B and enterprise, I think about value as, sort of like it sets the stage for getting to alignment. At the highest level, it's getting to alignment. So a lot of my just, personal experience and looking into this space research wise for the startup, alignment dictates the success or failure of every opportunity that you're in, right? How closely does your buyer team feel like what you're offering aligns with what they're trying to accomplish,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think like, okay, cool. What role does value then play in that? What's that about? And, to me, you have to be able to understand what value means to your buyer, what it looks like. So it's kind of the way I would define it is like, how your buyer sees the world through the lens of the problem that they're trying to solve. That's how you think about value for them. And so being able to understand what your buyer's definition of value means from the very beginning is what will dictate, are you on a good path for this opportunity or not?
And it's also uncovering kind of their language and how they speak internally, right? And that's a misconception a lot of people have is that everyone is stating things the same way with the same words. And that's not always the case. And I think one thing that I always liked about you is, you would dig in a little bit and ask more about what do you mean by that,
Yeah.
right? Because we make assumptions all the time, placing our own preconceptions around words and phrases. But ultimately, you need to find out what they mean and what when they say things and how they communicate that to each other.
I love that you brought that up because at the end of the day, right, we are all just people interacting together. And so whether you're a buyer, seller, it doesn't matter. We are just trying to accomplish our own things that we're doing. And so to your point, being able to really listen up front, to deploy some empathy, to ask good questions in how you engage with somebody, it's going to determine the way that that person perceives you. Are they pitching to me? Are they talking about their product right off out of the gate? Or are they actually trying to understand so that I feel, and maybe this is like a little, corny, but so that I feel seen and heard in what I'm trying to do?
Now, how often do you find that you need to alter the way that you're stating value to kind of translate it to the customer side? Does that happen every time, or does it happen some of the time?
I think it's a great question because to your point, everyone's a little bit different. And so sort of the principle of design thinking or customer centricity says you start with the customer, start with the buyer and understand what their view of the world is, right? That's kind of my definition of like, what is their view of the world as it relates to this opportunity? And so if you start with that and you can understand from a personal standpoint, from a professional standpoint, the way that their company kind of has the language and so forth, the description, what is that picture?
Mm-hmm.
And then it allows you to shape how you talk about what it is that your company does, how you bring value to customers, because you're going to make sure that you're aligning it with how you're hearing them describe this area.
That's really important, Ryan, because one of the things that I started out on the services side of the world before I actually got into being a pre-sales person and being very engaged in sales. And it was not an uncommon thing to witness when we would come in on the services team where there was misalignment in deals that we had actually landed, both on the services and technical side, because there was the difference in vernacular and terminology and just the way people explain things would result in there being an expectation of X when we were really delivering Y. That's a bad place to find yourself as a service person delivering. How widespread do you think that is? And what do you think the impact is on sales success of people getting stuck in their vernacular and not doing the exercise of trying to understand the customers?
I will always come back to this, Kevin. I think it's the number one reason that deals don't get done.
Mm.
It's the number one reason. And, it's easy to be like, well, the salesperson or the sales team they didn't ask good questions, or they didn't share it in a way that resonated. But you have to think about, how are sales teams trained? They're trained on their product. They're trained on their software, right? So their training consists of, how do you present this? How do you understand how it works and the value, what kind of functionality it produces for people? Like, that's how they start typically. So it's harder, to your point, to flip that around and just like, I'm not going to think about my stuff at all right now. I'm just here. I've told my teams, and again, this maybe sounds a little bit weird, but like I've told my teams, think about yourself as, you're the therapist, you're the counselor for your customer. All your job is to understand where they're at. That's all I want you to do to start. Don't talk about our stuff at all in the beginning. Just seek to understand. And it makes a huge difference. And I'll tell you, like, our experiences are one thing, that's great. But I also like to make sure that, like, in benchmarking, how real this stuff is. So Gartner, like, why is value and why is doing these things that we're talking about so critical? Gartner says, like, three quarters of buyers say, we give the business to the first vendor who demonstrates value to us. That's where we're at.
Right.
And yet, on the same hand, buyers are saying 80%-ish of the sellers that we work with are not bringing relevant information to us. So whatever's happening, right? Whether it's the way they've been trained, the way they're bringing this, the way that they're using the vernacular, alignment is not happening in a way that value perception doesn't seem to be synced up.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's changed over the years, or has it always been the case and now it's just more prevalent because of the access to information? Or how has that shifted, do you think?
It has changed significantly, right? And I think there's a couple of key factors. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on this kind of climate, but it's changed because we know that 80+% of a buyer's, like, research, information, purchase journey now happens before they ever reach out to a sales team. So a lot of those early signals of intent or discovery information, insights that maybe, to your point, used to be shared over to a salesperson to help them form their view of this buyer's perspective are no longer, like, your window is getting drastically reduced, right? And what you have access to. And so I think that's a key piece, because by the time you get connected with somebody, if you're missing something, they've already formed a good portion of their perspective, what they think their solution needs to look like, what they see as the competitive landscape in your space, and you've had little to no hand in that. Mm-hmm. So it's really important to be that good listener and ask those good questions, which, as we say, doesn't always happen like that. I think the other thing that's happening that I've seen, which is not a big, this is not rocket science or a surprise, is that we are in such a climate right now, buyers and the focus on their deals and how much more scrutiny the allocation of budget and capital is getting, right? Previously, you maybe had a little more leeway as a buyer. Your team is given this budget, like, okay, go make some good choices. Now, I think we've seen just there's more, like, what's the ROI? What's the value that we're going to get from this? How quickly is that going to happen? What kind of, like, show me the roadmap and the blueprint that your vendor has produced that's going to get us from where we are to what they're saying they're going to do for us. And I think so. In order to do all those things well, you have to really understand your buyer's view of value.
Mm. So they formulate an opinion of what the value of your solution or this type of solution should be. What if it's a little off? in terms of what it is.
Exactly the question I was about to
How
ask.
how
Yeah.
how do you address that in a way where that doesn't one put them off? But I think be how would you answer that?
So if sort of like the buyer's view of value or definition of how they're
Let's
thinking
say
about it.
it's very limited. We're gonna get this because it's gonna do X, but
Mm,
there's a bunch of other things that it can do. They're just not really looking at that, right? And
okay.
maybe it's irrelevant to what they want, but
Yeah.
not taking the time to expose them to that and explore whether that's important to them. I think it's a missed opportunity to be a consultative seller for one.
100%.
But I mean, have you seen that happen?
Yeah, I love the way that you're positioning that because some of the best opportunities, some of the biggest deals that I've seen have come from a starting point of what you just described,
Mm.
where we thought it was kind of like it's this one thing, but actually it's something quite different. One example of that, we're at a global CPG and they bring us in to help them sort of reimagine or streamline their help desk, their centralized help desk, which serves, let's say, hundreds of thousands of employees around the world. And this probably looks like maybe a $500,000 to $1 million deal. We'll do some reimagining, some redesigning of the way that the processes are working and so on. And so we get into the workshop. So you think that like, okay, it's this help desk fixing, there's cost associated with that. We get into the workshop, which is basically just, a larger forum for discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And we start to just ask the questions like, hey, when you're waiting for your system or your software update or whatever it is on this, like, what are you doing? What does that look like? And we started to hear that, well, we're kind of hamstrung in a way. We're so reliant on access to our network and access to the company systems that, it really kind of puts us in like a pause mode. Oh, tell me more about that. So you start to hear more of these stories where you're getting a theme of like a lot of downtime.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just help desk. It's trying to access these other platforms, Workday, Salesforce, et cetera, that we have to try and interact with to do our work. And we have the same downtime challenge.
Mm.
So then we said, okay, maybe this isn't a help desk thing. This is a productivity leakage issue. And so we did some math, like not, just like mostly like back of the napkin kind of stuff. Like, hey, what's the average cost of your employee overall blended ballpark? And, how much time are people spending that they're describing in these conversations that we've had? Okay, so you have, 280,000 global employee, right? So just the big numbers of the equation. We figured out that like you're somewhere between $100 and $200 million a year in productivity leakage.
Wow.
From these struggles that your people have when interacting with your system. Luckily, we have an offering where it could actually support some of this. So it went from like a $1 million deal to a $15 million deal, which was still giving them 10x back every year. But that came from not just saying, you want help with help desk, great, let's do that. And actually seeking to understand and, being the therapist, being the counselor, and like, oh, tell me where it hurts. Like what happens when that occurs, right? So I think but to your point about being consultative, it requires that mindset of like, I'm not just thinking about my software that solves your help desk. I need to go to the next level and then another level and really understand holistically what is impacting what's happening in your help desk.
Mm-hmm.
That is a scenario where you see some of the biggest unlocks, not just for maybe like our company as a vendor getting bigger deals, great, but think about the impact to that global CPG.
Mm-hmm.
And now when we started to do phased rollouts of those productivity, their executives are able to talk about like we've reduced productivity costs by X millions of dollars. That's a great win for everybody.
How does the executive or audience change for that value description, right? Because the value goes from, oh, we're fixing the help desk to we're solving a huge productivity issue. Is that communicated to different levels of executive chain, or how did that conversation kind of morph?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I can't say that this is, of course, it's going to be a little bit different in every situation, but this is maybe an opportunity to talk about something else that's really interesting for value creation. So we're at the help desk level in that situation, right? And when we start to see there's other opportunity and there's a broader impact, now you can go out to their executive messaging, their quarterly earnings report, and just learn more about what are they focused on at the executive level.
Mm.
How might one of those core themes that they've communicated to the street or their investors or whatever it might be, how might one of those tie back to this opportunity, this value area that we've uncovered, that we're working towards? And can we strengthen what it is that we're proposing by connecting it? And sometimes, if you're dealing with folks on the customer side who may not just off the top of their head connect the dots and be like, oh yeah, our CEO, actually, that's his number 3 thing that he, you know what I mean? So taking that initiative to sort of align how at the executive level they're thinking about that. And the way it worked was, it was literally just that. Hey, I read that your CEO is talking about ways in which to improve efficiency in the workforce. Yeah, that's right. And so then you're kind of just helping them and coaching them a little bit.
Mm.
And so then it gets up to their next level, their VP, and so on. And because everyone wants to share good news and something that's potentially a benefit and an impact in that capacity to the business. So you just have to give them the message, and then direct it up the chain.
It's encouraging and very interesting what you're talking about, Ryan, and I'm very much on board with what you're describing. In today's buyer-led type of transactions, we're talking about when they're still doing the buying, we're crossing over a little bit your conversation about the actual delivery itself.
Yeah.
But in the buyer-led conversation, they're coming in, they believe they're 80% there. What are ways that you can bring someone back to challenge their own assumptions about what your solution can do, so that you get the opportunity to have them find additional value that can be addressed? Because is there resistance on the part of some of these organizations that they think they've understood the problem and they don't want to explore it? How do you get them to open up to accept and hear and challenge what they may believe to be the circumference of the problem relative to what you're going to give them?
Yeah, I like how you phrase that, and I like the circumference of the problem, right? Because it's a great visual of what you're describing. Like, a lot of times you've got the buyer who's like, okay, this is the thing we're doing, right? And we have and actually it's maybe a little bit different. And I don't think that there's an easy answer. I do think that there are some like practices that you can deploy that that work well. I think one of the ones was what I described, which is looking at the most macro level of a company, of an organization, to understand what are they focused on. What's their executive suite actually communicated that they're focused on, that their initiatives they're putting time and capital against. And I think being able to verbalize with your buyer, let's say your buyer is at the director level, or whatever it might be, right? And I think it's validating that, hey, I totally understand. I want to validate where you've gotten to. You've done a lot of research. You've gotten this perspective on what the solution is for you and how it impacts it. That's fantastic. I know that's not easy to do, right? So you always want to validate first, totally recognize what goes into that. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you'd be open to considering something that I've been thinking about, that, right? So you're asking to be invited to share some perspective. I'm not going to tell you like, you're looking to work with so-and-so competitor. Right. That's not my approach at all. I'm here to listen, to validate, and ask to be invited to share some other perspective. I'm going to set the stage like that. Right. Because no one wants to be challenged. No one wants to have suggested that they didn't do something correctly. But maybe if I could just add something, a different perspective, something that we've seen work really, really well with some of our other customers, right? Or, I had another account that was doing the same thing, and they found this information, really useful in the way that they ended up shaping what they did. Most folks are going to be open to listening to something that could be relevant to what they're seeking, right? That's kind of the mentality that I feel like works the best.
I know you shared with us in the past, a little bit about internally how you go about kind of understanding and creating a value statement and value map, right?
Yeah.
But then what was really interesting is that you also had a way to then, after you kind of capture it and map it, to then communicate it,
Yeah.
with them. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what that looks like from when you're approaching these solutions?
Yeah, I think the topic is, being able to define the value of your buyer team. That's great starting point. That's the thing that you want us to do first, right? It has to set the stage for everything that comes after, because that way you're keeping that customer centricity for all your messaging, your materials, your proposal. Everything is connected to that. But I think the mapping comes in with, once you have that defined, and you start to identify where there are opportunities, levers in this initiative that you're talking about. Some of the key things that you can do are, how do we've identified these things now. So we'll say, for example, it's HR, and you've been approached. You sell HR software, and you've been approached by a company that's looking to upgrade. Hey, we want to automate some of our stuff, and we want these better features for employees to connect with us on different things and different channels. Okay, that's not really the value, right? Because the value is, we're trying to reduce attrition of our people, because that's really expensive, and we're trying to improve engagement, because we know that there's a lot more productivity that happens when you have a higher. That's where the areas of value exist. And so the mapping back to that says, okay, now that we've understood where the real areas of value are in this for you, let's understand, how would we quantify some of those things? How can we put some numbers to help you with your business case and help you perceive, like, what is this decision that you have in front of you? But of course, also to help us position the way that we can bring value and associate a number to that. So it's, okay, you want to reduce attrition? What's your current attrition rate? What's the average cost of so you start to help them do the math. Mm-hmm. Put the ROI calculation into place, build the business case with them. And now, Matt, you're the buyer, I'm the seller. We're doing this together. I'm sharing with you some of the frameworks and the calculations that we use that have worked well. You're sharing with me some of the information about your company and what you're trying to achieve. And we're building this together as a team.
Right?
Yeah,
and then once again, you're back to, as you're building that business case and you're asking those questions, that's another opportunity for you to make sure that you're all speaking the same language and using the same values, right? So that when you come back with that business case, they're invested in it. I would assume that's an important step in getting that buy-in and getting them to sign on to the value proposition you're presenting then.
You're spot on, Kevin. And so if you think about, how does that play into real life, you would want to understand. So if Matt, the HR buyer, says to me, well, we need to be able to show, a certain level of return to make this investment. Okay. But what would a certain level of return look like? What does that mean to you?
Yeah.
Is that, a 6-month ROI? Is that a 10% return? Like, how are you thinking about defining that, so that we're speaking the same language, so that I'm speaking the language that you speak about this opportunity? And that is, that's at the foundational of staying aligned with the buyer.
Yeah, I think, a lot of sellers always want to provide some ROI and some numbers and things in terms of what that value point is going to be to the prospect or customer. But where I see it kind of fall apart is, a lot of times it's just a simple calculator. They just throw in numbers. Well, you got like 40 million people on the site and X amount do this. So automatically there's like your 20 million ROI right there.
Right.
And so it's not really done in a consultative way, right? It's more like you're just plugging in some numbers and like, boom, there you go. It's like when companies define what their market share is, right? It's like, well,
right,
there's 1 billion people in the world and blah. It's like, so, what advice would you have for sellers to really make sure that this lands and is heard correctly and doesn't just get dismissed as just a bunch of numbers that have been thrown together?
Yeah, you're right. It can be super easy just to put that into a spreadsheet, and here's your PowerPoint slide, and aren't you so impressed? What I've found,
are.
And they rarely are. Like, what? You're not ready to sign today? But what I've found to be effective, and this again, it's always going to come back to the customer. It's always going to come back to the buyer. When you talk about, like, the numbers and the figures, and it needs to be, what does the customer see as the critical numbers that we're going to focus on and impact? How are you defining the value as it relates to your metrics? And so I think when you start with that, whatever you and I, or I go back and do, if I'm going to bring you this information, this value perspective back, it's going to be based on what you told me is important to you. So I know that I'm not going to come back and you're not going to say, well, that's not really how we measure this, right? Because I started with you and what's important and how you define progress or impact. So I'm going to start with your numbers, and then we're going to understand, like, can you walk me through why you've chosen those, right? Why do they represent the impact of this? Because as we've seen, sometimes maybe there's a different mix that should be discussed around that. But let's say that we agree on the numbers. One of the best things you can do is use your customers' data. Always use your customers' data, right? As much as you can. Hey, sure, share. If you could just share me like a pull of the metrics from what we've been talking about that are key, we'll go back and use those numbers, and we'll butt those up against what we've seen with other customers in your space or in this situation. What have we seen when we'll actually help you look into the future a bit? Because I can look at 6 months, a year, 3 years, maybe in some of these situations that we've done, and we'll apply a like a conservative, a moderate, and more of an aggressive view. So we'll do it in a range just to get a sense, right? I found that work just exceptionally well. I'm not going to come back and tell you like, here's the number, but let's just do it in a range, right? Because as we all know, there's lots of moving parts that could affect how this rolls out. So here's that range, here's what it looks like, and what that equates to in ROI, what that equates to in X payback, and let's have that conversation. And then you tell me what maybe how should we modify that? What should look different about that? If we go to your CFO after we meet and we share this information, what are they going to push back on?
Do they know some things?
Yeah, to your point, are they aware of that we're doing this? And hopefully you've asked the question at this point, is there budget for this? And has it been earmarked for, hopefully you've done that part in your discovery. If you follow the template, then
Well, I know you talked a little while ago. We talked about a story where NPS was something that you were affecting. Do you care to share a little bit about that story? I found it really interesting.
Sure. So what's the best way? So this is good. So we talked about how value is changing, how kind of like the role of value is changing, right? And so there's a really interesting Forrester report that we can share maybe with everybody, like a link afterwards of this, sure. How it's a shift from like a focus on revenue to a focus on value creation. And so this, we'll call them an global IT platform company, very well known, large customer base. And they were having an issue with their content provision to customers across the journey. Customers were basically saying, we feel super frustrated. We can't find what we need. It's just, so they're calling the help desk a lot more than they should be, right? And so we were brought into like, okay, how do we streamline or reimagine this CX process for this company from kind of lead origination all the way through to deal and cross-sell, upsell, loyalty. And so what we discovered was that there were all of these areas where as customers were moving across their journey, they were not finding the information, the value that they were seeking from this company to get that job done, to move to the next phase of whatever arc they were on. Are they on the implementation arc and we're looking for implementation roadmaps and troubleshooting guides and things like that? Completely confusing in some of those areas. And so we said, okay, like you need to really pull back on what you're pushing out from a content standpoint. They're like, no, we need, there's not enough content. There's not enough good information. I'm like, there is way too much content, and it requires kind of rethinking the way that you're determining what to make and how to share it out across these channels. So pushback, kind of hesitation, like I don't think that's the right thing. We find an analyst in the company who's done some interesting work, done some math, who basically says, for every NPS point that we drop, we lose about $25 million in annual recurring revenue.
Yeah.
Okay, and so you're down 8 points, so you're down 200 million so far. Okay, what if we mapped the negative NPS reviews and scoring to where that came, like what customer, that group that came from, what was the issue and the struggle and that led to that scoring? Let's just pick the top 5. And if we build solutions and streamline those, we will be able to move the needle on that $200 million. And so now all of a sudden you've gone from, well, we think it's this, there's too much content, to here's the 5 things we're going to do. And it's connected to a very big quantified number. By the way, those are your numbers. This is your data that you're sharing with us. And we're gonna map that. Here's the plan. So I think when you again, you're connecting those dots and you're demonstrating, here is the value, here's how we capture it. That's the key. It sounds like it was an easy thing to put together. That was like 6 months, six months of, starting out, and there's like, you go down this path, and then you learn something new, and then, you finally get to it. But you get to that $200 million kind of like pot of value, and it's worth the pursuing and the asking and the seeking, in like, where is the value hiding? How do we get to it?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you explain that, Ryan. Matt and I have sat front and center in a number of different opportunities where trying to get to an understanding collaboratively of what value means has been so hard. We talk about that a lot in our methodology, about how value is not just a simple formula. You need to ask the right questions of the right people, and it's developed over time, right? Because it has to be something that they've bought into, that they understand as that value conversation is being built, and as you're mapping what you can deliver to that value, that they are already invested in that answer, right? And that they bought into it, right?
I like how you phrase that. And I know I keep saying this, but it's such a good, like, it's such a proven practice. To your point, one of the best ways to do that is to go back to the executive level of that company, go back to the 10K, go back to the quarterly stuff, and pull out, like, identify what is that company's focus? Where are they? Like, what kind of conversations likely are occurring in the boardroom today? Because if you can understand that to a reasonably articulated way, now you can just map that back to what you're working on or what you're trying to do or how you're trying to help. And it provides more clarity, and it helps provide you with more support to your buyer stakeholders in those cases, right? If you remember, Meta a few years ago had their year of efficiency. And Zuckerberg came out and said, hey, these are like the, 6 or 8 kind of like statements. These are the things that we're going to do. We're going to do more with less, and we're going to search and reduce duplicative work. All this, like, he was literally giving vendors the playbook. And so I was working with a company at the time, and we went and we said, okay, let's understand what Zuckerberg is focused on and his team. And then how do we map this company's offerings and outcomes to those things that they're trying to do? And let's build our account plan and our strategy and our go-to-market for this against that message. Because it's really hard when you're talking to someone and you're talking about something that's maybe like number 3 on the list, and they're like, hey, yeah, that's not really just something that we're really focused on. Like, how does number 3 map over to what you guys are focused on? And it's so then it becomes, well, actually, I guess there is an element of that, but so it just becomes really hard to kind of deny what the executive team has communicated is the focus.
Yeah, we've definitely tried to put out, I mean, I don't know if we've stated as elegantly or eloquently as you have in part of our methodology, but it's so key, right? Making sure it maps in a way that the customer is going to understand and immediately gravitate towards the conversation you're having. And it's interesting that so many sellers have a problem with that and struggle with it. I love the way that you've articulated the way some of those things are done here today. There's a lot of congruency and a lot of similarities with what we're talking about, but it's encouraging to know that there is a path, and if people stick to these kinds of methodologies, they can build that out.
I just wanted to ask, if you had one action step or one thing a seller or consultant could do today to improve their value-based selling approach or value mapping, et cetera, what would you say that would be?
Yeah, I'll give you two. One kind of a quick and easy one, and so it'll be a bonus, and then the other it'll be something. So the other one is an exercise that I do with companies who are looking to just like, how do we reimagine the way that we're engaging with customers? And so what I have them do is have them go back, look at your last like 6 deals. I want you to choose 3 that you won and 3 that you lost. And then for each deal, I want you to write out, was your view of the problem the same as your buyer's view of the problem? 2, how did you quantify the impact of the offering you were proposing? And then last, and maybe equally as important, did you get to all the right buyers in the opportunity, or was there somebody that was missed? Because those 3 things, did you start with the right problem? Did you quantify the impact of what you're doing? And did you get to all the right people to build consensus on this deal? Like, if you just have to strip it down to the bare minimum, let's understand what does it look like in a deal that was won versus a deal that was lost. And almost every time you'll see like, oh yeah, we missed at least one of those things was very different than the other, the other case, whether you won or lost. And then that bonus, I think, is not like rocket science, but I'll just come back to it because it's just so core. The first thing that you want to do when you're engaging with a customer, whether it's existing and it's a new thing that you're talking about, or it's a totally new, potential customer, start by understanding how they see value in this thing that they're trying to solve. Nothing else. Just start with that. And I promise you it will make a significant difference from that point forward if you start with that.
Yeah, I think the move, value led as opposed to product led is really the key. And that I think is changing in the way that sellers are taught, but it's still a long way to go. I still see so many just generic decks thrown up in the first meeting that tells about the company. And I was like, oh my God. So anyway, Brian, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. I could talk for hours. It's so much fun and interesting. If people want to connect with you, though, just for follow-up questions, or maybe they have questions about value, or maybe their organization is looking to improve some things, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think, reach out to me if we're not already connected on LinkedIn and connect, drop me a note. I would also offer like anyone who is doing interesting things around innovating in the, kind of the revenue team space. I would love to talk about that as well, because that's what I'm working on right now. So would love that.
Awesome. Well, hey, folks, thanks again for listening to another episode of Software Sales Simplified, Move to Success, our weekly podcast where we talk about all things around sales and selling. So I'm really glad to have you on again, Ryan. Just want to remind our viewers, I guess if you're on YouTube, or listeners, if you're on other channels, make sure to follow, like, subscribe, leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts about what you liked about what we're discussing, as well as other things that you like to hear about. Until then, Kevin, do you have any closing remarks?
Only that I really appreciate you coming in, Ryan. This is an area that I get very deep into. You and I both have the same philosophy when we're talking about any solution. We're not here to sell you anything. We're here to fix your problems, which is something that I absolutely embrace. And I really appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your lessons learned over a hard-fought career, my friend.
Well, thank you. And thank you both for having me on. This has been an honor to have this conversation. I love it. As always, our conversations are always super interesting.
All right. Well, on that note, thanks everyone. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week.